Welcome everyone to this latest version of the CSPC Career Campus series, where we're going to look at not-for-profit jobs. So how this is going to go down is we will have a first section where I will introduce our panelists and they'll talk a little bit about what they do and how they got there. And then we will stop recording so that you guys can ask the questions you have freely. You can either ask them in the chat if you don't want to go on camera, or you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself and ask them to the panelists directly. We will be going until a little after 1 o'clock, so feel free to gather up all the questions you have, and don't worry, I have my own if you don't have any. So, first person that we're gonna be getting a little peek into the daily life of is Bonnie Schmidt. She is the founder and president of Let's Talk Science, a national education charity that supports youth engagement in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So, Bonnie, do you want to tell us what you do and how you got there?
Thanks, Alessandra. First of all, thank you for the invitation to join you today. I always love talking about my career and my fellow panelists for this. I think we'll have a lot of fun, especially when we get into the Q&A. Just to give some context for people who are interested in talking a bit later about pathways, Let's Talk Science is a national education charity that really focuses on STEM education. I've just realized that my screen is now me, so I'm trying to figure out how to change it, so I'm not just looking at myself. Anyway, STEM education, science, tech, engineering, and mathematics. We really focus on training educators and young people, getting them involved in experiential education, and we now work with 52 universities and colleges, mobilizing about 3,000, 4,000 volunteers from coast to coast to coast, and I'm really hoping that we've got some Let's Talk Science volunteers and alums in the audience today. We were talking just before we went live that I'm actually celebrating my 30th anniversary of starting Let's Talk Science when I was a graduate student. Yeah, I can't believe it. You can see it from the hair for sure. I've proven that. Anyways, what started that? I'll tell you a little bit about the early backstory, and then I'll flash forward to what I actually do on a day-to-day basis. I was a graduate student at Western doing a PhD in physiology, third year of my 5-year experience doing my graduate studies. And there was an economic recession at the time in the early 90s. So funding to the science community was hit pretty hard. And at that point in time, there was really very little outreach that was happening. So I had gotten quite involved in my graduate cohort at the time and was involved in faculty councils, P&T committees, and a few other things that were happening on campus. And so heard the dismay from the researchers and decided just to set up a small project. So that little project actually engaged about 6 grad students at the time and has since flourished. That original program still is the anchor of our Let's Talk Science Outreach program today. So that's been pretty exciting seeing so many universities and colleges getting involved. Over time, I didn't change jobs over the last 30 years, but I sure changed what I did on a year-to-year basis, right? I was the one delivering programs in the schools to the teachers for much of the first 10 years as we began to onboard people and hire people and actually have a staff. But over time, that part of my work actually went away. So the passion of what I had wanted to do in communication and getting young people involved actually began to morph as the business side of what needed to happen in order to actually build a sustainable charity kicked in. So had to learn a lot about fundraising. And as an aside, as a graduate student, I remember being in doing my experiments every weekend and thinking, oh my God, I do not want to be writing grants like my supervisor was doing every Saturday sitting in her office. And now I do that regularly. And we actually have to raise more money now than I ever needed to think about as a graduate student. So the position really started to shift. As we got bigger, we needed to be thinking about systems and protocols and policies and governance and fundraising and whatnot, to the point where now the things that I did early on, I almost never get to do. And so I'm very public facing, but the joy in the job is I get to do really fun things like this. I get to do a lot of the external stakeholder development work. And while I'm still regularly fundraising, it does open up opportunities to talk with different kinds of people. Over the last 2 years, I've also gotten more involved in international projects. So maybe in the Q&A, we can talk a bit more about how advocacy and policy development does actually come into play with my role at Let's Talk Science, even though you might not think it would be because it's all about education. I'm noticing the time, so maybe I'll just pause there and we can dive into some more details during Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Bonnie. Up next is Dr. Naveed Aziz, who serves as CEO of CGen, Canada's national platform for genome sequencing and analysis. So if you want to tell us about your day today.
Sure. Thank you, Alexandra. Okay. Before I start, I think it's worth mentioning that applauding CSPC's work in this regard in setting these career campuses. I think it's a critical thing to do for our next generation and youth. And I think CSPC taking the leadership role in this is absolutely amazing to see. So kudos to Meredith and the team. So as mentioned, my name is Naveed Aziz. I'm currently serving as the Chief Executive Officer of CGen, which is, as mentioned, is Canada's national platform for genome sequencing and analysis. We were established in 2014, employ about just over 200 people across 3 sites in the country. So it's a national platform in Toronto at the Hospital of Sick Children, in Montreal at McGill, and in Vancouver at the Genome Sciences Center. So as the CEO, my responsibilities include working closely with the Canadian government, industry, and academic partners to strengthen the power of research of big data in enabling discovery and commercialization at a national scale. I make sure that we continue to build on our strengths, leveraging our best resource, including our people, expertise, and our infrastructure. So coming to the point here, in terms of how this links to my training and education and my career trajectory of how I got here. So during my early education, I always had the passion for scientific discoveries and was always drawn to new and exciting scientific outcomes, a bit of a geek in that sense. Especially during my PhD, what intrigued me was the technologies that were enabling this exciting science and the opportunity to push technology boundaries to enable all the cutting edge research. It was somewhere during my early career that I realized, and I think this is relevant to the trainees in the audience today, it was the realization that my true calling, was more towards enabling and supporting world-class research rather than committing to a purely academic career, as Bonnie mentioned, of writing grants and publishing papers and so forth. Where this is a prestigious career path, don't get me wrong, I just did not see myself in that role if I looked 20 years down my professional future. So while doing my PhD and postdoc, I also had the opportunity to figure out new technologies. And when I really got really good at it, I found that I was asked by other researchers to help them and collaborate with them to support and enhance their technology-driven aspects of their research. It was at that time when I realized that there was a need for people who can lead technology development and its application in the bioscience research area, people who have the technical ability to understand the engineering aspects of the technology, but also the scientific background to understand the need of the application. As I got more involved, I also realized that there was another large missing piece of so to speak, of this triangle now, which was the management of technology platforms and the management of the organizations that provide such support. So when I finished my PhD from University of Dundee in Scotland, and then a postdoc at the Nobel Foundation in the United States, I then transitioned into, consciously transitioned into running a regional technology core facility at the University of York in the UK. And again, relevant to the audience, the reason I could transition to a research facility / management role was that while in my PhD and postdoc, I was always involved in some sort of a side hustle in pushing the limits of technology and coming up with cool ideas to repurpose and fine-tune existing technologies for new and better use. And when it came to finding the right person who can manage a large technology-based facility, I could offer more than just my operational skills. I was able to excite the university and the hiring committee with the potential for the institutional leadership by providing some of these cutting-edge services to the wider research community. So for the university, it really became an additional business offering at the time. So that's what I kind of I could offer in addition to my other expertise. So after my transitioning, just trying to wrap up in this new phase of my career, I did something that confused my parents and stressed my wife, although she never really showed it. I went back to school. I enrolled an executive MBA at the Bradford School of Management in the UK. And when we get to the question, if somebody's interested in knowing why I felt the need to enroll an MBA, I can talk about that. But when I did enroll my MBA, I really absolutely loved it. I learned a lot. I learned a lot of the leadership and the organizational behavior aspects of what I wanted to do. What I learned in the leadership was that mostly it was about people management. Fair enough, there's an aspect of experience of managing everything else, but really the aspect of expectations management and people management is a huge part of that. So I learned through my MBA. I ended up in Ottawa about 10 years ago, immigrating once again from the UK, initially from Pakistan to UK, and then UK to Canada, working for a nonprofit agency, Genome Canada. I was their director of technology programs, leading to the design, development, and delivery of many technology funding programs, which really brought together my science background with my analytical skills and my people management skill. And coming full circle about 4 years ago, I was trusted with leading CGen, recently announced as CEO, as Bonnie was mentioning. I'm excited by what I do. And really, it's the difference we make on everyday lives of everyday Canadian genomic scientific community that really helps me get out of bed. Thank you very much.
Okay. Our next person is also a recent transition. So up next, we have Rachael Maxwell, who just recently joined Evidence for Democracy after being also at Genome Canada for several years. So, Rachael.
Hi everybody. And yes, it is very fitting for me to follow up from Naveed there, since only a few months ago, I was in the thick of Canada's genomics enterprise. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are joining from. And of course, big thanks to CSPC for the invitation today. I think it's a great discussion, and I hope everybody will take away something useful for them today. So as already mentioned, my name is Rachael Maxwell, and I'm the very new executive director at Evidence for Democracy, or E4D for short. If you're not familiar with E4D, we are a national, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization, and our work is really focused on promoting and advocating for the transparent use of scientific evidence in government decision-making in Canada. So we do this because we really believe that we all benefit when governments make decisions informed by the best available evidence. And we achieve this at E4D through original research, issues campaigns, and education and outreach programming. And I like to think of what we do at E4D kind of in the broader sense as helping to raise the standards of evidence for Canadians, and by really engaging in that critical three-way relationship that if you end up in science policy, you have to be very aware of. And that three-way relationship is really between science, society, and policy. And then in terms of my day-to-day, I guess, at E4D, Naveed said this, that it's a lot of people management. And so that's my first point as well, is I'm always really focused on my team, making sure our work is appropriately distributed, that they're well supported. And then of course, I'm really responsible for fundraising, which Bonnie has spoken to as well. That takes up a lot of my mental and emotional space. And of course, executing against our long-term strategic plan. And so really thinking about how our activities contribute to the long-term objectives and mission at E4D. But I guess the real puzzle is how I ended up here, which I'm going to try to summarize as briefly as possible. So I've been working in and with science and research not-for-profits for coming up on a decade, which is shocking for me to even say out loud. But had you suggested to me 10 years ago that I would end up working in science policy and doing science advocacy work, and that I'd really become so invested in evidence-informed decision-making and science and research in Canada more broadly, I would have never believed it. So which is sort of the first point that I do want to emphasize is be prepared for the unexpected as you move through your career trajectories. Don't cling too tightly to specific ideas of where you need to end up and how you think you should get there. I got to where I am because I was really open to opportunity, like open by default. And I just sought out the opportunities and let it all unfold. But so what is that story exactly? And it's probably worth pointing out here that I actually have a background in the humanities. I have a master's in cultural policy and arts management. And I spent much of my academic years in Italy and elsewhere doing archaeological field school and studying art and art history. My younger self was very, very intent on spending as much time in Italy as possible. So my educational background is quite different than the other folks on this panel. And after university, I worked in the arts and cultural sector for several years. And while I enjoyed it, I often had my eye on other opportunities, and I had always really been interested in policy and how government works and advocacy work. So I'll spare you the messy in-between details, but suffice to say, my constant curiosity eventually led me to MyTax. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with MyTax, but if you aren't, MyTax is also a national not-for-profit. They run a suite of programs that connect post-secondary talent into work-integrated learning experiences, typically research-based internships. So MyTax was a really big turning point for me. I met really great people, many of whom have become pivotal to my own professional trajectory and who I now consider mentors. And in my 5 years there, I was in a few different roles, but there was one in particular that really brought me into science policy. So I ended up working on a then pilot program, the Canadian Science Policy Fellowship, which is modeled after an American program, the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, some of you may be familiar with. And it's a program that brings PhD talent into government host offices for year-long fellowships. So I had never done program design. Science policy was new to me, but I had really great people around me, and there was a lot of momentum and support for a program like this in Canada. And I also learned at that point, I think in that experience, that one of my advantages was actually not being a scientist. So I had to bridge a lot of different stakeholders together. So government folks, academia, training specialists, and of course the PhD fellows themselves. And I had to bring them into some sort of coherent program. And it really often felt like a riddle that I had to solve. How can I make it all fit together? And not being overly attached to any one of the stakeholder groups. So I wasn't a scientist, I wasn't a government person. I felt that I could sort of sit outside of everyone, observe the bigger picture, and then bring them all together. Anyways, after managing that program through its first 3 cohorts, I shifted gears and I took a role at Genome Canada, which was totally new to me. This was, science, capital S for me. In my roles at MyTax, I didn't really have to speak science language, let's say. But at Genome Canada, I had to take in a lot of scientific information that I was not familiar with. Suffice to say, a few years on, I think genomics is amazing, and I'm a lifelong fan now, which Naveed, I'm sure, is thrilled to hear. But again, at Genome Canada, I worked in a couple different roles in communications and public affairs, and then later with the president and CEO on a variety of initiatives and organizational priorities. So working closely with executive management was a big game changer. I got a really different view on how organizations function, what it takes to manage them at all different levels, and the details of the day-to-day and the execution on long-term vision. And that brings us to here at E4D. And like I mentioned, the role is still very new. I just started this spring, and the learning curve is steep. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but I think the learning curve is always steep, and I've come to expect that. And as far as I'm concerned, I think a steep learning curve is really good for us in professional environments. Working with so many scientists over the years, or scientifically trained individuals, I've come to realize that transition from specialist or subject matter expert to all of a sudden being in a totally unfamiliar territory like policy or program design is really hard. And on my end, not being a STEM trained individual, I've also struggled at times as, to really feel like this was a professional environment that I belonged in. But I've also come to appreciate that any endeavor, scientific or otherwise, does require diversity of backgrounds, viewpoints, skill sets. And being challenged and being in really unfamiliar territory made me get really comfortable really quickly with what I'm really good at. And of course, at the same time, I learned to seek out the complementary skill sets and viewpoints from others that just weren't in my own toolkit. So I leaned into those skills, the skills that I was really good at, really hard, and leveraged them to navigate and move into different roles in all these organizations. And I think we might have a chance to get into some of what those skills are a bit later, but I just wanted to offer a brief reflection on the science and research not-for-profits in Canada, because I think it's worth emphasizing. So all of the organizations I've been associated with, MyTax, Genome Canada, E4D, the Science and Policy Exchange that Shawn's going to talk about, they all started in some sort of grassroots fashion. And same thing with Let's Talk Science, as Bonnie mentioned as well. So there's this really wonderful and inspiring thread of grassroots advocacy that comes out of the scientific community in Canada. And while the details of these stories definitely vary, the theme is often the same. There's a group of scientists who saw a need, a gap that wasn't being filled, and they mobilized around that need. They mobilized and they convinced whomever they needed to convince, whether that was government, funders, or other stakeholders, could be foundations or individual donors, that this organization was valuable to Canada and that it filled an unmet need and it needed to exist. So these are really powerful origin stories, and it's something I think a lot of at E4D is this need to stay connected to the grassroots organizing in the scientific community in Canada. And I think that these stories really bring a very entrepreneurial spirit into these organizations. In the beginning, they're really functioning off of sheer willpower, and that really ends up taking hold in the culture of these organizations and becoming part of their legacies. So I'll end there and look forward to speaking a little bit more and elaborating on some of these points in the Q&A.
Okay. Last but not least is Shawn McGuirk. Just like Naveed mentioned, a lot of us have side hustles. Shawn's not-for-profit appears to be a side hustle as well. So by day, he is a senior policy analyst at NSERC, but he's also a director and past president of the Science and Policy Exchange, of which he's going to talk about.
Thanks, Alessandra. I'm really, really happy to be following Rachel here. Just what really sets the stage really nicely. I'm here mostly to talk about Science Policy Exchange, but also in just kind of seeing the swath of speakers, people we have here, I also realize the extent to which my own career development has kind of built off of the kind of nonprofit science policy environment. Like really my career path into where I'm at NSERC depended on the MyTax Canadian Science Policy Fellowship Program, which Rachael worked on. Dependent on the work that I've done with Science Policy Exchange, which really exists because of the actions of Merdad and his team, who set up CSPC over, I think, 11 or 12 years ago now. Science and Policy Exchange was set up pretty soon after the first CSPC conference, really from a group of students who attended that conference. Students from McGill who saw a need for students to be able to engage in that space and really didn't see a place to do it. So they decided to set it up themselves. For the first couple of years, organized a somewhat similar conference, but really focused on having students at the center of the conversation, mostly centered around Montreal. And quite a bit centered on Quebec policy issues. So we often had Rémi Guérillon, the chief scientist of Quebec, who was also started his position around the same time that SPE started, to talk about issues at that level. So SPE really started as a student group and became a nonprofit in Quebec, which is the point at which I joined. I actually joined out of my PhD. Not knowing anything about science policy. I had been involved in another side hustle at the same time as my PhD. I was a very distracted academic while I was doing my PhD at McGill in breast cancer metabolism. I had started a startup with a group of other students and had learned how to pitch for funding, how to pitch to the venture capitalists, to apply for funding from various sources, and how to set up we've really had to set up a business for what we hoped at that time would be a fairly long-term gig, but like most startups, it didn't last too long. So I got pulled into SPE because I had that financial knowledge, and SPE did need to raise quite a bit of money to run their conference every year. And through the last, almost 8 years of being involved with SPE, we've built it into now a little bit like Let's Talk Science. It's also now a national education charity, which is run mostly online via Slack. We now have volunteers from pretty much everywhere across Canada, running quite a bit of events now virtually because of the pandemic. And it's really become a platform that enables the next generation of scientists to come together, exchange ideas, perspectives, develop their network, explore new solutions to science policy issues. And SPE as an organization really does its best to try to support that capacity building, to let students and trainees really explore the science policy space, see how they can build a career in this. It also produces and disseminates a lot of resources for science policy, and engages stakeholders pretty much across sectors to amplify and promote the voices of the next generations in science policy discussions. And really one of the biggest skills that I gained through being involved with SPE, again, as a side hustle, unpaid on the side of my PhD, which is why my PhD took so long. I was really running a Canada-wide charity nonprofit with a very large team of folks, with the help of a great board of directors, including Rachael and the great Paul Dufour, who I'm sure many people here know. It was really a work integrated learning opportunity to learn how to manage a team, how to manage the finances for an organization, how to manage an organization to itself. And really, as far as essentially the first president of SPE, all of the alumni coming out of the organization are now in public sector or private sector jobs in Canada, in the US, in Austria, in Switzerland. And these are all folks that really gained a huge amount of skills from being involved in what's ostensibly the management of a nonprofit as an extracurricular activity. So SP is fairly unique in that space, although I will say that a few SP volunteers have recently launched a new nonprofit in BC called Sphere, which I think we really should look out to for great things in the near future. So I'll stop there, and glad to talk more about SP, what we do, and about my career path and questions.
Okay, so thank you to our speakers for giving us a rundown of their career to date. I also want to thank the events committee of CSPC who helped make this happen, specifically Victor, who was the lead in getting everything organized. And I also want to give a shout out for following in Shawn's footsteps and attending the CSPC conference. Our registration just went live, so you can go to cspc2020.ca, where also the link will show up in the chat if you want to register. The student fee is heavily discounted. So definitely something you can try to sink your teeth into, and I guess see all of these people again, I'm assuming. Okay, so this is now where the recorded portion of our talk will end.